At the weekend, the US President Donald Trump claimed that there have been record number of Christians being killed in Nigeria, and says the US could send troops. Troops are on standby to intervene. Now, Donald Trump has framed his comments in religious language. He's described any U.S. Military intervention as fast, vicious, and sweet to defend, and I quote, our cherished Christians. There have been plenty of response to Donald Trump's claims, including from the president of Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who said that Nigeria stands firmly as a democracy governed by constitutional guarantees and religious liberty. The characterization of Nigeria as religiously intolerant does not reflect our national reality, nor does it take into consideration the consistent and sincere efforts of the government to safeguard freedom of religion and belief for all Nigerians. There have been plenty of political responses to Donald Trump's threats, but I speak now to Professor Dion Forster, who argues that this narrative is false and it's politically motivated. It's a form of populist propaganda aimed at energizing Donald Trump's Christian base ahead of America's midterm elections next year. Dr. Dion Forster, really appreciate your time with us. He is the University Research Chair in Public Theology at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. Good morning, Dion. Really appreciate your time. How do you interpret Donald Trump's claims of a Christian genocide in Nigeria? Sounds very much familiar to a so-called white Afrikaner genocide here in South Africa, which is also not true.
Lester, morning. Yeah, it is, this is typical of Trump's playbook. This has very little to do with Nigeria and just about everything to do with the midterm elections. So as his popularity in the polls is flagging in the United States, and he's needing opportunities to draw attention from, the government shutdown and the Epstein files, all these things that everybody knows too well. He's appealing to a base in America that is activated by a certain kind of language. So it very much is attached to this notion of Christian nationalism, the fact that the United States somehow is exceptionally chosen by God as a Christian nation, and that therefore they have the responsibility not only within the United States, but around the world to propagate that view of Christianity. And it is deeply dangerous, and of course it's problematic on so many fronts.
Dion, I've not just heard these comments exclusively from Donald Trump. I occasionally get sent WhatsApps. Sometimes WhatsApps come to our WhatsApp line here with a headline, either Christians targeted in Eastern Congo, or Christians targeted, or churches burnt in northern Nigeria. If you scratch a little bit and you check the veracity of those particular news articles, or check the veracity on which website that particular article is hosted on, it's not from any mainstream traditional news source. It is a thought, or it's a belief held by many people, and not just Donald Trump. How do we determine the veracity of there is widespread and wanton targeting of Christian groups around the world?
Yeah, so Lester, firstly, just to say there is no doubt that there is violence in Nigeria, particularly in that northern belt, the northwest region. My daughter Courtney did her master's on this, looking at Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, and there's a lot of research, on this particular area. The one thing that we do recognize is, of course, there are the sort of targeting of Christians and Christian groupings. But it seems to be that it is also, if we just look at the population that's targeted, there are also persons who are Muslim, persons who are African traditionalists. So anyone who's regarded in a sense as haram, unclean, is targeted. We know, for example, a couple of years ago, there was the story of the kidnapping of all of these schoolgirls by Boko Haram, supposedly because, girls shouldn't be educated. So it's not only Christians that are being targeted. And of course, the targeting of Christians is a reality. But it seems that certainly, it's Boko Haram. There's a farmer-herder conflict which is going on in that middle belt, and it's both Christians and Muslims that are suffering. And the kind of sort of targeting of that by persons like Donald Trump, but also by some other Christian nationalist groups around the world, is very much playing into a particular playbook. It's this kind of culture war. It's the cynical emptying of the Christian faith, or the Muslim faith for that matter, and turning it into just an identity marker. To say, if you worship in these spaces or dress in this way, then you're one of these persons and not those persons, and that leads to conflict. I mean, that's simply not true.
Yeah, you're right of how it's wrapped up in some sort of culture war. It is the cries of how religious freedoms are being persecuted because of the concept of what is the traditional Christian family is somewhat being targeted. If you talk about the espousing of positive reproductive health options, if we're talking about issues around LGBTQI plus issues, it somewhat gets wrapped up in, well, you are infringing on my religious identity by somehow forcing down these concepts that may be foreign to me, not necessarily outright religious persecution, but you're right, wrapped up in some sort of culture war that many on the right of Christianity feel that they are being personally attacked.
Yeah, and so Lester, it's not only Christians. Of course, all of the world's living faiths are wrestling with these tensions. The fact that society is changing, that because people tend to have greater influences from outside. I mean, if you think about 80 years ago, you probably knew the people in your village or maybe the village next door, but now everybody has a smartphone. They're being influenced by all sorts of ideas from across the world. And, religious traditions do feel these tensions. So there are legitimate reasons in which all of these religions, whether it be Islam or Christianity, Judaism, all of them are wrestling with what it means to enter into this new world. The challenge is, and this is where I think public theology is such a fascinating discipline, is that not all beliefs are religious. You also have these secular beliefs. And some of the secular beliefs are, for example, nationalism. I mean, let's just go back to the Trump example. When Donald Trump says, God bless America, which God is he calling on? Is he calling on the God of Islam? No. Is he calling on the God of Christianity? Many Christians would say no. It's some kind of an American God. It's filled with this idea of the myth of the red, white, and blue. And that's part of what I think we need to, in a sense, engage and deconstruct using responsible, reasonable, factual, evidence-based arguments.
What then goes through the mind of a fervent Trump supporter? For as far as I know, and I've listened to enough interviews of Donald Trump when asked what's his favorite book of the Bible, and he sort of stutters and goes, well, all of them. Seemingly can't name a book of the Bible. But at the same time, you have fervent supporters of Donald Trump says, well, he's essentially a representative of God or Jesus in the United States. How can you square this circle by someone who is, from what I can see, actually a-religious, but being used as this placeholder for religion?
Yeah, Lester, look, there is also no doubt that Donald Trump has come under the influence of some really significant and popular religious leaders, Paula White being one of them. You may remember when he was voted out of office at the end of his first term, she famously said, the African angels are coming to save him, in a sense. But this is known as the sort of Cyrus principle. So there was this prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, Isaiah 45, that King Cyrus, this sort of ungodly king, would be used by God to achieve something. So many Christians in America see this. They say, well, God can even use a crooked pencil to draw a straight line. And so in some senses, what they're doing is they're comparing some of these big ticket issues, like in their minds, racial purity, abortion, the homogenous family. So these sort of Charlie Kirk type issues. And they're then saying, well, the sort of smaller misgivings, the fact that he's a serial misogynist, that, he's sexually immoral, that he's racist, that he's capitalist, all of these things, they can be forgiven because on the big issues, he's on our side. I mean, in some senses, I think that, Trump himself is being manipulated. But I think by the same token, so are the relatively uninformed American electorate.
Just very quickly and broadly on how one's religious identity is very much also your political identity. I've spoken to enough security analysts. I've spoken to enough people in Mozambique, for example, Cabo Delgado. And yes, there is a presence of the Islamic State there, but that is not necessarily a religious fundamentalist conflict there. That is a resource conflict that plays itself out in the gas fields on Mozambique. Just happened that the people who are embarked on this resource curse war just happen to be Muslim is simply just part of their political identity as well. So often when we have these conversations of religious extremists or fundamentalists in some resource cursed part of the world, we somehow wrap that up into saying, well, these must be Islamic fundamentalists who want to create some sort of worldwide caliphate, when in fact it's just religion part of people's political identities who just happen to be in conflict around resources. In this example, in Mozambique, could very much be the oil fields of the Nigerian Delta as well.
Yeah, I mean, Lester, look, so let me say two things about that. The one is that religion is a very important part of people's lives. And we see this, 85% of the world's population is religious in some form or another. And it offers resilience and hope and a sense of morality. And I think we need to be careful to conflate, for example, Islam with these kinds of Islamic extremists, or Christianity with the kind of Trumpist nationalists. They're not the same thing. Part of the problem that we have in places like South Africa, where 86% of people say they're Christian, is we have this very textured insider view. We know my auntie is Catholic and my uncle is a Pentecostal and this one's a practicing Christian and that one's not. But when we think of Muslims, we think it's one thing. And that's a mistake. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that all of these religious things are political. If you belong to a religious tradition that says women and girls may not be educated, that's a political belief. You're affecting your society. And part of what I think we need to do is we need to interrogate those kinds of beliefs in relation to the systems themselves. I mean, Islam as a religion of peace, Christianity as a religion of peace and flourishing. These religions need to critique those things and say, well, we don't think that's the core of what we believe.
Professor Dion Forster, really appreciate your time. Professor of Public Theology at Vrije University in Amsterdam. Thanks so much for joining us here on Good Morning Cape Town.